I'm coming to you from Spartanburg, South Carolina at another small liberal arts campus. So I was so excited to be here and to meet you all, and thank you for coming out. I know you lead very busy lives, so I appreciate you fitting this in. To start us off, I want to read a definition of a term. Some of you may know this term, positionality. And this is from Luis Sanchez in the Encyclopedia of Geography. Positionality is the notion that personal values, views, and location in time and space influence how one understands the world. In this context, gender, race, class, and other aspects of identities are indicators of social and spatial positions and are not fixed, given qualities. Positions act on the knowledge a person has about things, both material and abstract. Consequently, knowledge is the product of a specific position that reflects particular places and spaces. So to start us off, I thought I should give you my positionality. And I'll go way back. I was actually born and raised in the neighboring state, Indiana, from a working class family in Lafayette. So you might have heard of West Lafayette. There's a Purdue University's there, and Lafayette's the more industrial neighboring city. I'm first generation college student, and I usually think back and think if I hadn't lived neighboring a college, I might not have gone to college. A lot of my family, they were stay-at-home parents, or maybe you worked at a bank, and I did get a job in high school at a bank, and many family members said, well, why don't you just stay working at the bank? You get a nice new car, you can pay your rent. So this was kind of the context from which I was growing up in. So I had never met a Muslim growing up. I had never visited a mosque. And then I was in high school and 9/11 happened. And I'm part of a generation where that event in time and place stays with us. And I can tell you exactly what happened on that day. I was sitting in my high school classroom, taking the SATs. It was a 3-hour test. The doors were shut. We weren't supposed to interact with anyone, but there was a TV in the room. And when the principal came on the loudspeaker and announced that the first trade tower went down, we switched on the TV. And we watched that happen in this room. And I always think to myself, what would have happened had that been the one event in my life? And I stayed in this little town, and I didn't go to college, and I had never met a Muslim. Well, luckily for me, that didn't happen. The next month, my high school was hosting 20 students from Uzbekistan. And they came, and one student stayed with my family, and that's a Muslim-majority country. And that summer in May, I spent a month in Tashkent. So I got to befriend and live with Muslims, and that was huge. That was a huge perspective for me to see what it's like to live in a Muslim-majority country, and it was really significant that I got to hear my host sister say how scared she was to come to the United States, right? Her family wasn't really happy that she's flying over to the US, right? And so then the American invasion of Iraq occurs. Had I been in my working class town in Lafayette, Indiana, I probably would have been experiencing that through the lens of the media and the people in my hometown that were near me, that didn't have the education to go to college. They would have never had an Islam class, and I can imagine what some of the rhetoric would have been like. But luckily, I was on a scholarship called the Congress Bundestag Scholarship, living in former Eastern Germany. And so I got to see the way the American invasion of Iraq was talked about and viewed from an international screen. And I will say that 17-year-old Courtney was the first time I was able to critically analyze and step outside of my own culture. So the things that I thought were normal and just kind of the West as the best place in the world, I was able to check that assumption. And I had very key, important people in my life there that were helping me kind of see the world from a bigger picture, and specifically some of the political issues going on in our country and how we were interacting with the world around us and maybe overreacting after 9/11 in the MENA region. So that, I think, really shaped me, and it led me to go back to Germany in college. That was my undergraduate major with sociology. And I befriended many Turkish Muslims living in Germany because the largest immigrant population in Germany are Turks. And they came over, they were invited by the German government after World War II to help rebuild. They were called guest workers. And in the field of guest worker critical cultural studies, we say, isn't that unique to call someone a guest worker? We don't usually make our guests work, right? And, they came to Germany, they worked hard for Germany, and then people thought, many German citizens thought, well, they should go back to Turkey, right? They should go back. We're done. But that's not how reality is, right? We live in a place, we set roots down, we have our families come over, we become part of that culture, right? The Turkish Germans became part of German culture, and there's still a very vibrant community in Germany today. And now we have Syrian refugees in Germany, right? So we have a great population of Muslims in Germany, and that's what took me back to Germany to look at how the state governments in Germany are actually setting up Islamic theology programs to train imams in Germany to be imams for mosques in Germany. Throughout my studies, I ended up getting a lot of money from the US government. So they took me to Uzbekistan. That was a $650 trip in high school to spend a month in Uzbekistan, and I raised that money by selling cheese and sausage. That Pepperidge Farm. Maybe some of you guys did these fundraisers in high school. So I always say I funded my first trip to a Muslim country through cheese and sausage. Went there with that scholarship through the State Department. Congress Bundestag was a soft diplomacy measure started after World War II in 1946, where the German equivalent to Congress, called the Bundestag, would send 300 German high schoolers to the US, and the Congress would fund 300 high school Americans to Germany. And then in my master's and PhD, I was funded by the State Department's Critical Language Scholarship. So this is a fund where they will say, for these non-Western languages that are not commonly taught in the US, like Turkish, we will fund you to go in the summer and live with host families and immerse yourself in that language. So for 3 summers, I went to Turkey and lived with my Muslim host families, and I got to eat wonderful foods, and I got to visit mosques with them, and I really got to see what it's like to pull the curtain back and live in another culture again. I'm kind of addicted to this host family thing. I tried one last time. I was going to learn Indonesian through CLS, and they said, no, you've had enough. We're done. And we don't think you're gonna work for the government. We think you're gonna go into academia, so we're cutting you off. So, and at the time, I didn't even really realize that this is kind of this soft diplomacy that the US does, right? Education is a big form of soft diplomacy, and I was a part of that, not even really knowing it at the time. So that's where I'm coming from, and it was through those host family experiences that I had an idea to study what started as Turkish arts festivals. That was gonna be my PhD dissertation. Went to Turkey, and Gezi Park happened in 2013, these massive protests in Istanbul. And so the dissertation took a turn, and the dissertation was on kind of these protest cultures and social movements within Turkey today. And now I am teaching Middle Eastern studies at a small liberal arts college. But I wanted to show you, this is how I've been educated as a Westerner looking at the MENA region. I am first generation, white, non-Muslim scholar teaching these subjects. All right. So I wanted to go ahead and start us off by getting us on the same page with some of the basics about Islam. Has anybody taken a class that talked at all about Islam? Oh, great. You guys are ahead of the game. So bear with me. For those who haven't, I just want to go through some of the basics, all right? So it's a monotheistic religion brought by the Prophet Muhammad through the revelation of the Quran in the 7th century Arabia. Allah is Arabic for God. Muslims believe Allah to be the same God worshipped by Christians, Jews, and other monotheists. And you may have heard of the 5 pillars, which are the creed. So Muslims do a creed in Arabic that basically roughly translates to, I bear witness that there is no God except God, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God. And if I were a practicing Muslim, I would be saying, peace be upon him, after I refer to the Prophet Muhammad. Prayer 5 times a day. There's a pillar of giving charity, almsgiving. And you may have heard of a festival or a celebratory holiday known as Ramadan. This is a month-long practice where Muslims will fast from daybreak till sundown. And the last pillar is if you have the financial and the health to do this pilgrimage, you would go to a pilgrimage to Mecca in present-day Saudi Arabia. And just some short facts. All Muslims place authority in Muhammad as the last prophet. Their authoritative texts, so I would say like the equivalent of the Bible, Torah, would be called the Quran. And then there's also a secondary text called the Hadith, which is kind of the life of the prophet, the saying of the prophet. There are 1 billion Muslims around the world, 3.45 million here in the US. And believe it or not, I think sometimes when we think of Islam, we think of the MENA region. But the largest population of Muslims in the world today are actually housed in Indonesia, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. And Muslims are the second largest religious community behind Christians in many Western countries. And I always like to tell my students, Christianity is to Islam as Christian is to Muslim. Right? So when we're talking about the religion, we refer to it as Islam, and when we're talking about the practitioner, they're referred to as Muslims. They worship in a space called the mosque or masjid, and their kind of holy day, their congregational prayers occur on Friday. All right, so we're now all on the same page. And what my edited volume was actually about was how do professors in the West teach about this topic? And I have 3 things that I think are really key from what I've experienced in my own classrooms and kind of looking at the landscape of teaching Islam in a non-Muslim majority country. And the first issue will be Islam viewed as a fundamental other. Second, we'll talk about ISIS. And then lastly, Islamophobia. So what do I mean by Islam as other? Well, what I mean by that is oftentimes when academics in the West talk about Islam, we talk about it as a religion from another place, in the MENA region, right? And actually, there's a movement to start teaching about its fundamental history here in our own country. Muslims in America, right? They've been a part of this country's history from the very beginning, coming over on slave ships, being forced to come here from West Africa. So I have a new course called Muslims in America where we learn about Islam from within, right? Not as this other religion practiced somewhere else, right? And the premier scholar on Muslims in America is Edward Curtis. He's not far away. He's in Indianapolis at IUPUI, and he has a great short book called Muslims in America, very easy read, and it goes through a nonfiction way of writing about the history of Muslims in America. And my students just read chapter 1, and the response was, I can't believe I didn't know about this, which is a signal of power and privilege, right? The idea of what in history gets written down, what gets recorded, who gets remembered, and who is forgotten. And one thing that I'm very excited about in my state of South Carolina, in Charleston, there's this very large music fest called Spoleto. Maybe some of you have heard of it. And they are going to have a debut opera on the life of Omar ibn Said, one of the few early Muslim Americans who we have records of his autobiography. So Rhiannon Giddens is going to be writing this opera and debuting it in Charleston, the port city that he arrived in the US from. He was in South Carolina, then he was sold to Fayetteville, North Carolina. So this is a way that we're seeing a revisionist history happening, all right? So I think that's important in the field. So why am I here talking about Islam but also bringing up ISIS? And that's because in the West, what do we hear about? What screens do we hear about in the media? A lot of times we hear Islam with stories that are associated with violence, right? Whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's ISIS. And so a lot of my students, when they come in to a class talking about the Middle East, talking about Islam, these are the questions they have. And there are many different ways to approach this. Some Islamic scholars say, you know what? We don't want to talk about it in our intro Islam class. And I'll tell you about a scholar who has a great novel way of putting it to the side. And then there's another way, and I think this is all about going back to that term positionality. Would I want to take on the weight and emotional labor of talking about Al-Qaeda or ISIS if I was a practicing Muslim? Honestly, no. I probably wouldn't want to do that. I'm non-Muslim. I'm teaching majority non-Muslim students. They're coming with these questions, so the way I deal with it is we'll go over it. But I make sure to say, we're only going to spend a week on this topic, and it's the other to the topic that we're really describing, right? This is a radical other, and we shouldn't equate Muslims with ISIS or Al-Qaeda. But maybe you want to know what it is. Okay, so ISIS, referred to as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, it emerged in 2014 from Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Its origins, and I think this is important for Americans to consider, it's fear and violence caused by totalitarian regimes in Iraq and Syria. 2, big point, the chaos that follows the American invasion of Iraq. So we're a part of this. And 3, it's a very extreme version of jihadist ideology. A lot of my students want to know, who are the terrorists? ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc. It's a form of jihadism, and again, I remind them, this does not represent any traditional Muslim group. Totally new, starting in the 1970s, 1980s. It equates all Islam with warfare. No other Muslim group, past or present, does this. And ISIS, I would say, is the worst form of jihadism. Here is a problematic, yet I still think helpful analogy, if we are going to boil it down to a short analogy. ISIS is to Islamic culture as Nazism is to German culture, right? If you take a class on German culture, German language, your professor's not going to spend 3/4 of the semester talking about Nazism, just as we shouldn't expect Islamic Studies scholars to have to focus just on political Islam. And we're, quite frankly, not really trained in that. That should be perhaps someone in the political science department, right? Not in the religion department. Both have roots in, so if we're talking about this analogy of ISIS to Islamic culture, Nazism to German culture, both have roots in these larger cultures, but are not considered by anyone to be part of the mainstream tradition. And then we're going to get to that last point of Islamophobia. And some might say, well, does this really exist? Is this really a thing? Well, let me give you some statistics. And also kind of put it in this way. Saying and asking the question, does Islamophobia exist? That's an issue of power and privilege, right? And if we're thinking about Islam, remember it's a minority religion in the US, only about 1% of Americans are Muslim. And if we think about a working definition of privilege, it's when you aren't personally affected by something by not acknowledging or seeing it. So if it doesn't affect you, if you're a Christian, you're not Muslim, you don't go to mosque, you're not being threatened, it doesn't happen. That's kind of the privileged position of saying, well, Islamophobia doesn't exist, right? By non-Muslims, right? If they're not personally affected by this. And I like to tell my students, you know, it's like if I, as a white person with white privilege, say, I don't see color. Yeah, I just don't see color. So this is something I like to talk about when talking about this term, Islamophobia, right? To say maybe it's not a thing is in and of itself problematic. So almost 20% of Americans would deny Muslims who are American citizens the right to vote. According to the FBI, the number of assaults against Muslims in 2016 reached its highest point in modern American history, surpassing even the number in 2001, after 9/11. About 41% of Americans say, quote, Islam is more likely than others to encourage violence among its believers. We're going to be talking about an organization known as CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations. And they have an interesting report that there is indeed an increase in intimidation and discrimination against Muslims that have gone up exponentially around the US. And if we look here in Columbus, Ohio, we have a few examples ready at our hand. This is a shirt that was actually CARE reported and asked to be removed because it's offensive in that it's basically sending a message that if you're Muslim, you could be shot. In Arabic, it says, stay back 100 meters or you will be shot. And this is a sign that was often used by American military during the American invasion of Iraq. This t-shirt was sold in Columbus at a shop called Sports Possessions. So it's a sporting goods shop selling this t-shirt. The Masjid Omar ibn al-Khattab in Columbus reported receiving threatening phone calls in late February 2015. The caller aggressively spat out words of profanity, insults, and threats, referring to Muslims as Nazis, garbage, trash, saying, lose your religion or lose everything, and used racial slurs and threatened to bomb the mosque, saying people would be scolded. In 2015, a Somali-American Muslim named Ismahan Issa dropped out of the Columbus Police Academy because of a ban on headscarves. Columbus has the second largest population of Somali immigrants in the US. And here's a map, just to get a feel for this issue, of police officers who are allowed to wear the hijab. The green cities, Memphis, Atlanta, Charlotte, DC, Baltimore, New York, totally allowed, not a problem, to be a police officer and wear the headscarf. Yellow, it's unclear, hasn't come up yet, and the red are where it is officially banned for on-duty police officers. And you see there in red is Columbus, along with Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Houston, San Antonio, and Philadelphia. So an issue of, do you have the right to practice your religion to its fullest extent and choose to wear the religious clothing that you see fit and still be a police officer in this country? This is up for debate currently. This is an issue. So the overall message that I like to share with my own students when teaching about these issues is that we're in a time where difference is not always celebrated, right? And we need to appreciate those unlike ourselves. And so let's work to view Muslims as human, and Islam as complicated. That seems so simple, but that's what we're still trying to do in Islamic studies in the United States. Learning to understand and appreciate Islam will actually make us better global citizens. And something that happened just last month, the Trump administration has threatened to take away funding from Duke University and UNC Chapel Hill because they feel their professors and the program they're teaching about Islam and Middle East studies is too pro-Islam. And just to put that in context, Duke and UNC Chapel Hill, they have a combined program where they share professors, and they're one of the leading institutions in this country for training Islamic studies professors, right? So this is a little bit scary for our field, right? This is a lot scary, right? And I hate to say it, but I don't think the Trump administration would like this edited volume. I really don't. This is the good thing about being at a small place and getting to teach great undergrad students and be under the radar. What we did is we had 16 different authors contribute to the book so that you get a feel for these different ways of addressing this. Just like we want to see the complexity within Islam and we don't want to see a single story, right? We don't want to generalize. Just because I teach Islam in my particular way, from my particular context, with my particular positionality, doesn't mean everyone else does exactly what I do. So this gives you a feel for how other professors around the US and in Western Europe approach this subject matter. So there's 3 parts to the book: approaches and theories. Part 2 is Islamophobia, Islam and violence, and then an application section. And I just want to highlight, to finish us up, a few of the chapters. One is one that I co-wrote with a scholar who is kind of my collaborator at Al-Azhar University in Cairo. We ended up deciding to link our students through what we called a virtual exchange, right? So one of the issues in Spartanburg, South Carolina is I'm teaching a predominantly non-Muslim classroom, all right? And we do have a Muslim Student Association, but I don't think it's fair for me to ask those students to come in and represent their religion in front of a class. You know, as a Christian, your intro Christianity professor is not going to do that, right? So I don't want to single anyone out. We have a small masjid, a small mosque in town, but for the same reason, I don't want to ask practitioners to carry that weight. But I still want my students to interact and learn from practicing Muslims. And my friend at Al-Azhar, she's dealing with not Islamophobia, but the flip side, anti-Americanism. And she wanted her students to interact with Americans and see America from a different side. So we linked up our students. And we basically had a private Facebook group where the students became the curators of their own history and culture, right? So I had my American students do kind of a genealogy of their families, their traditions, their hobbies, their everyday life at Wofford College. And then Dr. Baumi would have her Al-Azhar students do the same in Cairo. So they were getting to see multiple ways of being a Muslim, and the Egyptian students were seeing multiple ways of being an American. And they were the same age, so I liked having that closeness and proximity there. And what we found is that this kind of built an understanding and communicating one's own culture while also building understanding and empathy for another culture. We used Skype sessions, the Facebook group, and also a WordPress blog. We also used some fundamental basic ethics from the American Anthropology Association and talked with students about not doing harm. We had to be very careful what topics we could discuss. You know, what is politically taboo to say, to talk about in Egypt, and vice versa. We wanted to make sure everyone was safe. Being open and honest, weighing competing ethical obligations on all sides, making our results accessible, and maintaining respectful and ethical relationships. And we found at the end of the day, the value in this was telling one's own story, hearing multiple stories, and connecting with real people, telling real stories, making real connections. I told you that there are some professors that say, you know, an intro Islam class is not an appropriate place to teach about Islamophobia. So one scholar who's at Wofford College in Iowa, Dr. Todd Green, he wrote a chapter on this idea of taking the concept of Islamophobia out of that class and creating an entirely new class just on Islamophobia. And he's saying we should have non-Muslims teach the class because it's non-Muslims that are Islamophobic, and they should be asked to fight that battle. We shouldn't be asking Muslims to fight that battle, right? And at the heart of his teaching on the course of Islamophobia, he asks his students to learn that if you're going to criticize Islam, there are three basic tenets. One, the criticism should be based on elements of the religion that many Muslims recognize as part of their faith and should avoid guilt by association or essentializing assumptions, i.e., we shouldn't be asking Muslims to talk about ISIS and tell us what's going on there. How does that connect to your religion? Secondly, these criticisms should not take the form of hate speech or endanger the safety of Muslims, and not be translated into actions that undermine religious liberties for Muslims. The last chapter I like to bring up because unlike Todd and I, Dr. Keisha Ali at Boston University, she is a practicing Muslim, and she teaches about Islam. She's also at a big state school, Boston University, so she's not at a small liberal arts college, so it's a little bit different. It's a politically very liberal city, and she wrote a chapter, and the basic of her chapter in her Intro Islam class is to convince Americans that Muslims are human beings. So this is not an issue in rural Ohio. It's not just an issue in small towns, Spartanburg, South Carolina. This too is an issue with students in big Boston, like this big urban setting. And she's saying connection is important. And she actually, in her chapter, goes back to saying, this was an issue before 9/11. Islamophobia was there. In 1992, there was a conference that was brought to UNC Chapel Hill by Carl Ernst, where they were asking people to communicate the basic tenets that Muslims are human, Islam is complicated. And what she likes to leave her students with is this idea that it's very easy for us as Americans who know about, even if we're not Christian, we know about this religion, we never assume that all Christians are the same, right? I know that in Spartanburg, South Carolina, that if I said, do all Christians do X, I'm gonna get a different response from a Methodist, a Catholic, a Greek Orthodox practitioner. And what Keisha Ali is asking us to do when we study Islam is to create that same amount of nuance when we look at Islam. So we shouldn't be asking, do all Muslims do X? Because the answer is no. It's very different, it's very complicated, as is any world religion, right? So we have to bestow what we will give to our own majority religious cultures in our own countries to the minority cultures as well. So just to wrap up, I want to go back to this term of positionality and leave you with one last thought. These issues of positionality suggest that there is always a relationship between the researcher and the researched. This relationship deals with the power and interpretation, as the researcher is the position of interpreting the lives of others. From this perspective, it is essential to draw attention to the ways in which representations do not merely reflect social reality, but are also part of it. The politics of positionality demand that attention be paid to the structures of power that privilege certain voices while silencing others, and endorse some points of view while dismissing others. In other words, researchers cannot ignore the problematic nature of what representation involves. As part of an in-depth self-reflection, one must know how to position oneself before drawing the line that makes the distinctions between us and them. So on your own time, just think about what is your positionality with this subject, right? What brought you here today? Something sparked you to come to this lecture. Maybe you're getting extra credit, but maybe there was true curiosity there. Maybe you're a part of that religious practice, but what was your genealogy to get you to this room? What do you know about Islam? What spaces and places affected how you view that religion? So figure out what's your positionality on this subject. Well, thanks so much for coming out.